I know, this game isn't retro by any means, but you know, I played it, and now I'm looking back at it. Retrospectively, I just like this game, and as someone with a background in film, I do think I have a thing or two to say about this game. So sit down, grab a snack, and come on an adventure with me. First off, I'm not exactly sure I would really call this a game in any traditional sense of the word. Yes, you're in control of a character, yes, you're walking around a digital world, but really, this is closer to a movie than it is to a game. But my god, I don't have time to get into what makes a game today. I am working on a video about that though, so try to find the subscribe button to stay up to date for that one. For now, I'll keep going in the game, just to keep things simple. As this game is extremely story-driven, it only makes sense to go from the start to the finish. Warning, if you have not played this game yet, go buy it, play it, and then come back. The story itself isn't something that's very spoilable, but the game as a whole is an experience which you probably should best enjoy playing. You're visiting your old family home with this little book that shows a family tree. As you walk through the forest to get to the house, basic plot is being narrated to you. This might feel like it won't go anywhere interesting, just your average walking simulator. And yes, the first part is just that, but as soon as you get to the house itself, you'll find that the key you have doesn't actually open the front door. Instead, you walk around the house to the back and use the pad door to crawl through. This is how you'll be making your way more or less through the entirety of the house, in very unconventional ways, through secret passages, climbing out windows, and so on. All because the doors in this house have been sealed up. In a way, moving through this house really reminds me a lot of walking around Hogwarts in a Harry Potter game, and that is very much a good thing. Walking and crawling around the house, you eventually find Molly's room, and this is where you get to the first sub-story. This whole game is pretty much just a vessel for telling a bunch of different, smaller stories, which are loosely connected through them all being about the same family. Molly is a young girl who, one night while she's in bed, gets hungry, looking up around her room for some food, but she can't really find too much to eat. But once she sees a bird outside her window, she opens up the window and becomes a cat, chasing the bird around the trees close to the house. Eventually, catching the bird, she turns into an owl, hunting rabbits. Step by step, she becomes a bigger and bigger animal, until she's some kind of monster that feeds on humans aboard a ship, before finding her way back into a very familiar looking room, becoming a monster under her own bed. As you can maybe already tell, any storytelling here is pretty abstract. What on the surface may seem like just a silly story about a girl who had some wild dreams after being hungry, symbolizes how people tend to strive for something bigger, better, stronger and more impressive, which in the end comes back to bite you in the ass, because Molly dies. You don't see her die, but you do get a death date for her, which shows you that she died very young. All the stories you play through in this game are about the death of the characters within them, and well, since you're playing as a character reading all of these stories, I'm sure you can see where that goes. Seeing Molly open up the window leads you to also go through the window and continue your path. I love how multiple times throughout this game, these stories actually show you how to progress in the overarching game. By now you'll also realize that this isn't just a first-person game like you might think. Lots of the actions you do aren't a matter of just pressing a button. You actually have to use your mouse or controller to make the character do certain actions like opening a window, sliding open a secret passage, and so on. If the whole first-person view, which admittedly has a pretty low field of view for my liking, wasn't enough for a deep immersion in this game, actually having to perform a lot of these actions will. You next find the story of Odin. This doesn't really have any gameplay, and it's just a bit of a backstory for the family, and how apparently there's some sort of curse. You'll see this as a trend. Some of the stories take up to 10 or so minutes and are crafted with a lot of love and attention. Then some of them require close to no interaction on your part, and mostly just feel like a kind of glue to hold the rest of the game together, which altogether just doesn't seem all that needed, since the art direction by itself just tells a whole big story, connecting all these little stories together, not to mention the constant narration. The same thing happens with the next story, Calvin. Here you're on a swing, going higher and higher until you're spinning around and fly off into the distance. Visually, this one is great. I actually felt some level of vertigo, something that games don't often manage to cause in me. Although I am a total pushover when it comes to height in real life. Even though I'm tall as shit. Barbara's story is where things get interesting again. This story is told through a comic book, where it's shown how she was a famous child actress who lost popularity after she grew up. Some morals about the dark sides of fame are in there for sure, but what I want to focus on is the presentation style of this one. Since you're reading a comic book, some of the panels will just be a little bit of the story, but when you get to play, you actually play with a filter that makes things look like a comic book inside one of the comic book panels. It's nothing too mind-blowing, but this is the kind of thing a game like this can do. I wouldn't want a whole game to present itself in this style, but for a short 5 to 10 minute section of a larger game, this is a lot of fun. Playing this story also leads you to the music box, which holds the key to the basement. Once again, incorporating the navigation of the house into these little stories very seamlessly. In the basement you read about Walter, who had lived here in isolation for a very, very long time, showing how boring and monotonous a life like that can be by making you open a can with the most slow and frustrating animation ever. Very much on purpose to invoke that feeling inside of you, the player. One day he decides to leave the basement. He takes a hammer and smashes through the wall, leading him outside. Now, take a guess what route you take to move on with the game story. Before he can enjoy his freedom from himself, however, he is hit by a train. I'm not quite sure what the moral of the story is. Don't be afraid to live your life. But the moment he does that, he gets hit by a train. Then, are they saying I should stay inside all the times? After Walter's story, you end up walking around outside for a little while, visiting the family cemetery and generally just getting a little bit more background info into your character and the whole family through narration. It was this moment that I realized that, hey, I'm reading all of these stories of people who died, and the narration is me writing a story. Oh shit! After having a nice stroll around the garden, you climb back up into the house and find Sam's story, where you see the world through an old photo camera, trying to make memories, which ironically enough would soon be everything that's left of him. As you know, everyone dies in these stories. I don't have that much to say about this one, except Sam is kind of a dick to his daughter who doesn't want to shoot animals. And he gets his karma dealt back to him when he gets yeeted the fuck off a cliff. Oh, and I love camera mechanics in literally any game willing to include them, because I'm a huge camera nerd myself, so I guess there's that. This is where things turn dark. I mean, literally speaking, it's been dark for a while now. Somehow it turned to nighttime real quick, but you find some divorce papers in a crib. Yeah, we're going there. Gregory is a baby in a bathtub, and yes, I can hear you think, they're not gonna kill a baby, are they? Yes. Yes, they are. I do feel this story leans pretty heavy on its shock value. You swim around with a little toy frog while your mom is on the phone in the background, and you can hear the narration talking about how happy you are, while you end up drowning yourself. It's really disturbing in multiple ways, but most other stories have some kind of relationship between the gameplay and the story being told. Barbara was famous, and you play a comic book all about her. Walter has the most boring routine ever, and you literally just sit there and open canned food. Molly was hungry and goes about finding food. You get the point. This story doesn't really have any link like that. Not that I can see, anyway. The same holds true for Gus, the next story. He's flying a kite, which you use to trigger the text to appear. It's a little fun mechanic, but isn't really related to anything at all. Maybe they don't all have to have something like that, but the ones with the strongest link between the story, morals, and gameplay are the ones that end up being the most memorable in this collection of stories. And while we're on track to complain, next up is Milton, which is literally just a short flipbook animation, which... Look, I have no clue what I'm even supposed to think of this. Apparently this is a reference to another game made by their studio, which, that's fun and all, but to incorporate it into this story in this way, let's just say I'm not a huge fan of it. But hey, who knows, maybe they're setting up a huge interconnected universe and you know what? No. Just no. Luckily, next up we have the last story, Lewis. And this is one that could have a video all on its own. It's probably the longest in the game, and definitely the deepest and most layered one. It's all about Lewis, who works at a place where he chops fish heads all day long. He uses a fantasy world to escape from the harsh reality of the actual world, diving in deeper and deeper while the real world becomes less and less relevant. You control his fantasy character with WASD, while constantly keeping the movement for the fish chopping up with your right hand. As it's such a simple and tedious task, it'll get automatic for you very quickly, just as it would be for Lewis. And just like his mind starts to wander, you get more and more control over this fantasy character, while the fantasy takes up a larger and larger portion of the screen, while all the sounds of the chopping machine fade into the background, sounding more and more distant as you go along. Eventually it takes up your whole screen, and in a way, becomes your new reality. But even when it seems like that, if you take a little bit of time looking around you, you'll see that the people around you lack faces. Even though this feels like the real world to Lewis, and now that you're this deep in it, also to you, it's made very clear that in fact, this is just a fantasy world for Lewis to escape into. What does that say about you? The person playing a game in a fantasy world about a guy escaping into a fantasy world? There is one final story about how Edith, the character you play as, left the house when she was young, which does indeed end with the confirmation that she did die, and that she has a child who is now the last living person of the family. And that's all the stories. Even with just going over these stories, I couldn't possibly show and tell you every little thing about this game, partly because a lot of this is open to interpretation. And maybe some things I didn't like, you can find meaning in that I did not. The game itself won't take you much longer than 2 or so hours. Short for a game, but I would suggest you don't look at it as if you're playing a game. Instead, think of it more as playing a movie. The whole house is filled with so much detail. Every room has so much personality, little items spread across the desks, floor, different color palettes, designs, and so much more. If not for the narrative portions of this game, it would still be highly worth it just to appreciate the art direction. I could talk about this game for a while. We'd be here all day. This video is mostly just meant to give a quick overview and brief analysis of the different stories within the game. Feel free to let me know which one is your favourite. If the answer is Lewis, tell me which one is your second favourite. And as I've said before, I'm working on some very interesting analysis and discussion videos, so please do subscribe and ring the bell icon to keep up to date with those new projects.